Hi guys, it's Ashley from the Front Line of Grief. I wanted to make a video for you today starting a series of cultures and historical practices. If you're new to my channel, this is a mortuary science student study hub. That's a mouthful. For mortuary science students to kind of get more study help. I don't know how it is at your school, but for my school, it's an online program. Everything is completely online on your own until you get to clinicals, which for me will be starting in the fall, about 60 days or so. But as for right now, all of my classes are completely online, and it's pretty isolating, and it's kind of hard to get everything under control when you're on your own. So I was searching through YouTube trying to find videos that would maybe help me grasp some concepts, and I wasn't having much luck. So I figured that you wouldn't be having much luck either, and here we are. So I wanted to create a channel to kind of help you with your content from mortuary school. And currently I'm taking a class, Intro to Funeral Services, and it's basically a history class. This is my textbook. It's the History of American Funeral Directing. And this book goes through all the different cultures, cultural practices, and things like that. So I want to break down each video to focus on one particular cultural practice so that we can get more in depth to it. And maybe if you guys want to leave me anything in the comments, if I forget anything or if I misstate anything, please feel free to let me know. I'm welcoming of positive and negative feedback. Like I said, I'm making these videos to kind of help myself study, to listen to the videos, and also to help you. You can listen to them while you're busy doing other things, don't have time to necessarily sit down and study. So I want to start with ancient Egypt. How we know what we know is from Herodotus, who wrote the book called History. He's known as the father of history, and he gave us a lot of insight into ancient Egyptian practices. And also the Rosetta Stone that was founded in 1799. It was full of hieroglyphics that we were able to translate and kind of get a better insight from that as well. So Herodotus and Rosetta Stone are the two things you need to know how we know what we know about ancient Egypt. You also need to know a primary and secondary reason for embalming. The primary reason for ancient Egypt is going to be religious. The theologies that they practiced were sun worship and also the cult of Osiris. So both of those religions required embalming of their deceased. So that's their primary reason. Their secondary reason was a fear of a plague, and sanitation was what they were searching for. So embalming made them feel safer that they wouldn't get infected by a plague or the Nile River be contaminated by the deceased. So back to the cult of Osiris. Osiris was the god of the underworld, and he was the judge of the dead. So ultimately, when you died, you faced Osiris. If Osiris thought you were an honorable, virtuous person, you would be put to perpetual happiness. And if you were a bad person or didn't pass through his judgment, you would be internally damned to misery. So that sounds familiar probably to you for a lot of different practices. So if you were good and you were passed into perpetual happiness, you would also take on the name of Osiris. So oftentimes at gravesites, in ancient Egypt, it would already say Osiris inscribed for the person to be thought to be an Osiris after passing. For sun worship, it was believed that the sun was the center of all things. The sun was where everything came from, and the sun was where everything goes back to. So in this belief, they believed in the circle of necessity, which was where your soul had to travel a 3,000-year journey. Average is what they call it, the 3,000-year journey to the sun. Your soul has to travel to the sun and then come back to your body, and that's when you'll be able to go to the afterlife. In this myth or story of ancient Egypt, it's believed that your heart would be weighed after you died. Your heart would be weighed by the god Anubis, who was the god of embalming. He would weigh your heart against the feather of Maat, M-A-A-T, or the feather of truth. And if your heart weighed more than the feather, then your heart was evil and you would be, a mut would eat your soul. A mut was the gator-headed dog that was with Anubis. So if your heart was heavier than the feather, you were deemed evil and he would devour your soul. If your heart weighed the same as the feather, then you would be deemed like an average person, not too virtuous, but not evil in any way. And your and your soul would take a 4,000 to 5,000 year journey to the sun to come back to you before it was over. If your heart weighed less than the feather, that means that your heart was very virtuous and you made very good choices to help a lot of people in the physical world. So therefore, you would be given a lesser journey, which would be 1,000 to 2,000 years for your for your soul to go to the sun and come back to your body. Ancient Egyptians also believed in 6 different elements of a person, that everybody had 6 different elements to them. The first and particularly most important for the embalming process is the Ba, which is the human-headed bird who lives in your stomach and contains your personality and soul. So there's a human-headed bird that lives in your stomach. His name is Ba, and he runs the show. So he's got your personality and your soul inside of him. The second element of a person would be the Ka, which is your guardian angel that demands attention from you in life and death. Next, the heart. The heart was believed to be the center of intellect and emotions. So not the brain. The brain was like a mucus producer. That's what they thought. The brain was only there to kind of make your saliva. So it was pointless. The heart is where your intellect and your emotions come from. Yaku is next, which is your immortality. And for me to remember this one, I just say, Yaku, I'm immortal. I know it's random, but it works for me. Yaku, I'm immortal. Your name, which always had a special meaning to you, and also your shadow, because if you were a worshiper of the sun, you would ultimately result in having a shadow. Central to their beliefs was that the body and soul would be together again in the afterlife, the body being able to resume normal activities per se in the afterlife with the soul inside. So it was very, very important that the bodies would be perfectly preserved. And this starts from the cult of Osiris. When Osiris was murdered by his brother Set cut his body into little tiny pieces and spread them amongst the 4 corners of the earth. Isis, who was Osiris's wife and sister, and their son Horus spent a lot of time scouring the earth, finding all the pieces, putting them all back together perfectly, and then wrapping them in mummy wrappings. And this was ultimately the first mummy. When these pieces were all put back together again, Osiris, as a god, had the option to resume his physical life in the physical world or to continue his life in the afterlife. Osiris chose to stay in the afterlife, which I always find funny because it reminds me of how L. Ron Hubbard chose to leave his physical body. So Osiris chose to stay in the afterlife, and this gave the ancient Egyptians belief that the afterlife wasn't necessarily a bad place to be. Some of the oldest practices were associated with offerings to the dead, where the people would bring lots of food and things like that. Sometimes the food would be left there to decay, and other times a tube would be led down to the deceased's mouth and the food would be passed down to them. It was very important to continue your attention to the grave. It was thought to be necessary because people would rob graves, so you would need to protect the body, the coffin, and all of the treasures that were buried with the person. So the making of the offerings became a little bit inconvenient for the people. Let me find this quote in here because I wanted to share it with you. The making of the offerings started to get a little inconvenient to the living. And so burial grounds became cluttered with people claiming to be professional embalmers and lesser priests. And these people didn't only make their living through their practices, but they also made their living through fraud and theft of things that were in the graves. The Great Pyramids were built in Necropolis. The city of Necropolis was built just on the west side of the Nile. And it was named the City of the Dead because this city was where all of the practices that had to take place with the dead, funerals, burials, and everything like that took place. The Great Pyramids were built there, and they were memorials and tombs for the rulers. And upwards of 4,000 years, everyone from the pharaohs to the slaves worked on this city and worked on this place. So this quote that I want to share with you is to stress that Egyptians gave so much attention to how their dead would be preserved. So this is the quote. It says, "In no other land, ancient or modern, has there ever been such attention to the equipment of the dead for their eternal sojourn in the hereafter. The beliefs which finally led the Egyptians to the devotion of so much wealth, of his wealth and time, his skill and energy, to the erection of the eternal house are the oldest conceptions of a real life hereafter of which we know." So they gave a lot of time, they gave a lot of thought, and they really put a lot of work into preserving their dead and making sure that things were done right. The threat of a plague was a huge fear factor for them as to why they wanted to keep things sanitary. To do this, they started using a dry burial method, which is where bodies were shrouded in coarse cloth and laid on beds of charcoal underneath 6 to 8 feet of sand on the edge of the Great Plain at Memphis, higher than the Nile's flood level. So this created a slow and inoffensive decomposition. I'm imagining that the charcoal absorbed a lot of the smell, and the sand kept it all, what's the word I'm looking for? Under wraps, sure. So it was also very cheap and affordable for families of the lower class, and it was available to the masses. Now, there were 3 methods that were common in burying bodies in the ancient Egyptian times. And they're in order of basically how much money you had. So the well-to-do had their brain and viscera removed, viscera being the organs inside the abdominal cavity. And the brain was just disposed of because the brain was thought to be basically nothing at the time. The organs, however, were embalmed in 4 separate jars called canopic jars. These jars were symbols of Horus's sons. So there's 4 different jars are I'm going to say these wrong. I know I am, but I'm just doing my best here, guys. Kebesenuf, which is the falcon-headed jar that held the intestines. And I remember this by thinking of a falcon eating somebody's intestines and me running up to them and saying, "That's enough, Queb's enough." So Queb's enough is the falcon-headed jar with the intestines inside. Mestha is the human-headed jar with the liver inside. And I remember this by thinking Mestha is the human with the drinking problem. So we have Mestha, human head, liver drinking problem, human with a drinking problem. So the human is the liver, Mestha. Happy is the baboon with the lungs. So I remember this because baboons, when they're happy, they go, ooh, ah, they have to use their lungs to do that. So happy, baboon, lungs. Tuamutef is the jackal-headed or dog-headed jar that contains the stomach. And I remember this by Tuamutef being a dog who's always hungry. So Quebsenef, falcon, intestines, Mestha, human, liver, happy, baboon, lungs, Tuamutef, jackal or dog, stomach. So those are the 4 jars that the well-to-do's organs would be contained in. The cavities of the body were then washed out completely and filled with spices and resins, and the body was immersed in a soda solution for 40 days. After it was removed, it was wrapped in linen and prepared for burial. along with the canopic jars. The middle class could get an injection of cedar oil in the cavities, and the body would lay on natron, which for, I think it was however amount of time it took for the cedar oil to dissolve the organs inside. The organs would then drain out into the natron, and the natron would be used to preserve the skin and the bones. The lower class, they would purge the intestines, soak the body in a soda solution for 70 days. And coffins were very important to keep the body off of the earth. The main coffins or things that they used to keep the body off of the earth would be mats, skins, baskets, and then eventually anthropoidal caskets, which were human-shaped caskets made to look like the deceased, and the sarcophagus, which was similar to today's burial vaults that would keep the body and the casket in there. One last thing I want to talk about for the ancient Egyptians, there's an 8-caste system. This is the system of the people that were involved in getting the funerals together. The Carib, forgive me if I'm saying that wrong, please correct me if I'm wrong. The Carib was the chief embalmer or funeral director, very high on the caste system priestly lines, and he only did the service for the pharaoh and the pharaoh's immediate family. Next under that was the physician, who was also the priest. Oh my goodness, excuse me, who coordinated with the family to get the funeral in order and get everything needed the way it needed to be. The surgeon was the embalmer who performed the embalming and the preserving of the body. The apothecary was the pharmacist who made the spices and resins and the natron and whatever was needed in the process of embalming. The designer was also a painter, and he designed the coffins, built them, and also painted and designed them. Dissector was the anatomist who made the initial incision on the left flank of the deceased to begin the embalming process. And the scribe was a lawyer who made the mark on the body so that the dissector would know where to make their incision. So the scribe literally did nothing except for make a mark on the body, and the dissector only cut that mark. So everyone else, and then the slaves, of course, performed much of the work if the families were not able to afford anyone else on the caste system. So we have the Carib, the physician, the surgeon, the apothecary, the designer, the dissector, the scribe, and the slaves. Those are the 8. Oh, excuse me. Another thing that's important to remember about ancient Egypt is that embalmers were viewed as priestly, so they were viewed as performing a very spiritual task when they embalmed bodies. This is all I have for you today for ancient Egyptian funeral practices. If you have anything to add, please leave it in the comments. Like I said, I'm studying right alongside you. I'm a mortuary student myself right now, and anything, tips, tricks that you have to remember things, please leave them in the comments. I'll love to read them, and I'm sure that other students will love to read them too. Don't be afraid to share your feedback, and I'll be making another video soon to tell you guys about Rome and Greece and historical American practices as well. So I'll see you guys soon. See you later. Bye.